Hey guys, I'm Jameson with RogueEngineer.com, and today I'm going to show you how to build this dining table, which I'm calling the J-Pedestal table. So for the full plans, make sure you visit RogueEngineer.com. There I'll provide you with the required tools, the materials list, cut list, and the step-by-step instructions. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So this year for Thanksgiving, we were expecting about 20 guests. We normally just scatter them all throughout the house, but I wanted to take this opportunity to do something a little bit different and build two giant dining room tables so that I could share the plans with you guys. One of which I'm about to show you, which is the J-Pedestal dining room table. It seats 10 people, it's 110 inches long and 42 inches wide. To get started on the legs, first we needed to prepare for the glue up. I cut all the boards down to size that I would need for the legs. Then I planed them down on both sides so I would have a nice, smooth face to glue up to. I also did the same thing for the feet. Then I glued up all the boards that I would need for the pedestal and let them set up overnight. Now that the glue is set up, I went ahead and ripped the sides off of each one of those boards that I'd be using for the pedestal legs. I took the paper template that I had, which will also be available to you guys in the plans. I took that template and transferred it onto 1/4-inch hardboard just because I was going to have to retrace this thing 8 times and I wanted it to be consistent. Once I had that cut out on the bandsaw, I was able to align that on my leg blocks and trace out the template. Now for the fun part. It was time to take these legs to the bandsaw and actually start to cut them out. Before I got started there, I decided it was a good idea to make some relief cuts as well as drill some holes so that it'd be easier to work the bandsaw. This process took quite some time. I definitely put my small benchtop bandsaw to the test with these pedestal legs. Now for the base of the pedestal, I actually ended up ripping down these 2x4s on the table saw before I glued them up, but I would recommend doing that after, just so that you have a nice clean line and you don't have to worry about joining everything up perfectly during the glue up. Then you can take your template and transfer your lines onto those parts, head on over to the bandsaw and trim them as required. As you can imagine, those cuts on the bandsaw were not perfect, so once we got done with that, we headed on over to the sander and sanded away. I took some of the scraps from those big blocks and actually cut some squares. The length doesn't really matter, but as long as the width is equal to the thickness of the board, and I just use those to glue up those J-legs. That just holds that pedestal together in the middle. It's not necessarily for strength, it's more for alignment. When I was trying to glue up the first pedestal, I tried to do it all at once and then cinch it together with a strap. That wasn't really the best way to do it. For the second one, I decided to use Rapid Fuse. This is a wood glue that's a really fast setting wood glue and it really helps speed things up and it's great for instances like this. So what I did was I took 2 J-legs, glued them to the blocks that I'd be using for alignment, let that set up. It literally only takes a couple minutes. And then I glued another J-leg onto the top of that. Once that one's set up, I was able to flip it over. I kind of set it on the corner of my workbench so that it would be stable and glued the other J-leg in place. This went really smooth and I would recommend this way of gluing up your J-legs as well. Now we can add the base to the pedestal. I used the Craig HD pocket hole jig to drill the pocket holes in the base parts and assemble them together. The issue is that the foot that you see on the base parts is kind of close to where the pocket holes need to be drilled. It is possible. As you can see, I did it with multiple extensions and I actually had to remove the collar and mark where that collar was to get an idea of how deep to drill. I ended up having to do the same thing with multiple extensions to screw the thing together as well. And then again, the base gets glued and screwed with 2.5-inch wood screws to the J legs. For my tabletop, I wanted to make sure that it was nice and clean. That meant no joints showing. I wanted to have a nice smooth top. To do that, I ended up ripping off the edges of the 2x12s that I bought. I ended up ripping them down to a final width of 10.5 inches. One big point that I want to make is that for the 2x12s, for this tabletop, you need to make sure when you're buying these or picking these out at the store that they are perfectly straight. I then took them over to the planer and made sure to plane the tops down to an even thickness so that they were all nice and smooth and the same thickness. With that all done, it was time to join the top together. The issue that I have is that I just don't have a whole lot of clamps. So what I wanted to do to make sure that this top was not only aligned properly, but that it was nice and tight and glued up, I ended up using a biscuit joiner to set biscuits in the joints. That makes sure that the top is perfectly flush with one another. Instead of clamping everything together, I simply just screwed it together with pocket hole screws. Not only does this keep the top together during the glue up phase, the added strength of the pocket hole screws is without a doubt a great addition. I let the top set up overnight, and then it was time to cut the ends off with a nice straight edge and add the breadboards. To make sure that my edge was perfectly straight, I used a T-square to mark the ends. I then clamped a long level that I had down to the tabletop and used that as a guide for my circular saw to get a perfectly straight line. I ended up doing this on both sides and cutting the tabletop down to the appropriate length. For the breadboards, I actually ended up using a 2x4 just simply cut in half. Then I drilled 2 Craig HD pocket holes in the end of each board and secured the breadboards at each end with wood glue and 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. I actually ended up routing around the bottom edge of the tabletop. This gave a nice little chamfer to the bottom edge so you wouldn't cut yourself if you rubbed up against it. I also ran a router around the bottom of the apron as well so that we would have some nice chamfered corners that wouldn't cut anybody, again, if you rubbed up against them. Then the apron gets installed to the bottom of the tabletop with 2.5-inch wood screws. If you planed your tabletop and your apron, you'll want to make sure that your wood screws are not too long. That way they don't bust through the top. Now it's time for the final assembly. You'll definitely need a hand flipping over the base and setting it onto the tabletop. The base doesn't need to fit perfectly inside of the tabletop as it's not going to be joined to the aprons itself. It's just going to be screwed to the top with 2.5-inch wood screws. I then flipped the entire table over, added a slightly larger chamfer to the top edge of the tabletop, and then stained the entire table in a mixture of briar smoke and dark walnut stain by Varathane. Once the stain had time to dry, we then applied 3 coats of matte polyurethane for added protection. Well, this was a fun project to build. It definitely tested my abilities, but all in all, we love how it turned out. Make sure you like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, and follow us on Instagram so you won't miss out on any upcoming project videos. Until next time, be safe and happy building.